All right, good morning, everybody. I've got this 9 o'clock. We'll go ahead and get started here, get rolling. If you would, let's open with a word of prayer as other people start straggling in. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for all the blessings that you've given us. Again, we are thankful for the opportunity to gather here with our brethren, to open up your word, to study from it. We ask, Lord, that you forgive us of our sins, that you will be with us and help us focus on the subject at hand, that we will grow in knowledge and understanding, that we will grow in wisdom and be better able to apply these things to our lives. We ask, Lord, that you continue to be with those who are sick or injured and those who are unable to be with us, that you will please help them recover completely and quickly if that be your will. We're thankful for your mercy and your Son Jesus. In his name we pray. Amen. Contact info if anybody needs to hit me up about anything, feel free. Schedule more or less on track. I'd like to do my best to finish chapter 8 today. May end up having to breeze through if we have time after we do that. Maybe come back and hit a few tangents if we're able to. Next week, get a break from Ecclesiastes, and Scott Shanahan is supposed to be here and kind of give us an update on his work. I believe that's correct. If I'm wrong, somebody correct me, but I'm almost certain that's right, yeah. All right, so we're still in Ecclesiastes, making our way through. We concluded with verse 18 of chapter 7 last week, and of course it's the same kind of stuff. Even though Ecclesiastes can often seem like this chaotic, random musings of this very lost individual who's searching for meaning and purpose, is actually a very structured book. These chiastic structures within chiastic structures is a pretty impressive composition when you really start to look at it, which could probably even change your interpretation of it if you're looking closely. Anyways, that's worth mentioning. And of course, he is taking us from a place of materialism, worldliness, to a place of God and spirituality, and that's really the main point of this book. And it's that very old philosophical question, what is the meaning of life? Is there any purpose? And this book is trying to address that. And we ended last week kind of with the thought, so verses like 15 through 18 really kind of about a balance. He said, don't be righteous over much, don't be overly wise, and neither give yourself to too much wickedness or foolishness. There's no reason to die before your time, but that you should basically trust God. That's how he ends with verse 18. So that's more or less our recap. And so here, 19 and 20 of Ecclesiastes 7. Wisdom strengtheneth the wise more than 10 mighty men which are in the city. For there is not a just man upon the earth that doeth good and sinneth not. So wisdom is good. It's stronger than strong, So, and there's, of course, a number of passages we go through in Proverbs that kind of reiterate the same thing. But I think most of us here understand the value in wisdom. And for a society who I think is maybe, I don't know, I think kind of put off values and virtue in a sense more for, materialism or like the physical strength and the physical things that you can gain in this life. It's a very pertinent message that we should have values, and wisdom is a value that I don't think is recognized as much today as it once was, or as much as it should be. And of course, in verse 20, basically all men have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. And of course, that isn't an excuse to say, well, everyone sins, so I can just sin. Of course, that's not the case. Romans 6, 1 and 2, Paul says, shall we continue in sin that grace may abound? God forbid. Of course, that's not the point. Jesus, even when he was dealing with the adulterous woman and her accusers in John 8, basically chased them off. You without sin cast the first stone. But then he turned to the adulterous woman and told her, sin no more. The point is for us to do better. However, we have to recognize we're going to fall short. And I think that's one reason in Galatians 6:1, for example, we're told that if one of our brethren has been overcome in sin or in a fault, to restore them in the spirit of meekness, considering ourselves lest we also be tempted, because we all sin. The goal is not to do it. That's not an excuse to do it. And then don't rub anybody's nose in it necessarily, especially if they're penitent, of course. These verses I do like a lot. 21 and 22. Also take no heed unto all the words that are spoken, lest thou hear thy servant curse thee. For oftentimes also thine own heart knows that you yourself likewise has cursed others. Man, we can apply this thing, I think, beyond its immediate context here. It's basically saying be careful what you're listening to. If you're listening, Solomon had servants. We probably don't. I don't. But if you're in another place, friends, colleagues, whatever, be careful trying to eavesdrop and hear what they're saying, because you might hear somebody say something bad about you. And he said, if that does happen, don't get angry, because you've probably done that yourself. You've probably talked about others when you haven't been around yourself. And I think we can apply this to so many other things, which we might do later. If we finish chapter 8 and have time, we might come back to this thought. But, it doesn't take a whole lot of imagination to see how we can apply that further. So the three takeaways I'm suggesting here is one, to live in such a way that people only have good things to say about you. I've known a couple of people like that. To strive to be one of those people, I think, is an admirable goal. The other thing is you only say things about others that you would say to their face. That's something we probably always have to remind ourselves of, obviously. And then we have to train ourselves not to be very sensitive when someone does something against us, says something against us, whatever. Train ourselves not to be vindictive. And I think it takes training. It takes consideration. That's not some natural thing, at least for most of us. We're like, oh, it's easy. I'm just not offended. There are things that can offend us. There are things that can hurt our feelings. There are things that can make us angry. We need to work on ourselves to not be that way and to consider other people like, okay, well, they've done that hurt, but yeah, I've hurt others too. How do things fall in here? Anyways, like I say, we may come back to this thought. I think there are a lot of lessons in these two verses. They're important to take consideration of. All right, let's read verses 23 through 25. Solomon goes on to say, all this have I proved by wisdom. I said, I will be wise, but it was far from me. That which is far off and exceeding deep, who can find it out? I applied my heart to know and to search and to seek out wisdom and the reason of things, and to know the wickedness of folly, even of foolishness and madness. So Solomon was saying that I wanted to be wise. I was searching for it, but it was far from me. And when I first read that passage, my thought kind of went to Matthew, I think 26, there were Jesus and his disciples in the garden. Jesus kept praying, and disciples kept falling asleep. And Jesus was like, can't you stay up 1 hour? Can't you stay up 1 hour with me? And they keep falling asleep. And Jesus had that phrase, he said, the spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak. And man, that is true. But I don't think that's what Solomon's getting at here. Solomon's getting at here, the wisdom was far from him. It's just, there was just too much to know. We can't possibly understand everything at all. He goes, but I searched for it, and I tried understanding this, and this is always such a strange phrase in my mind. So I wanted to seek out wisdom and reason of things, to know wickedness of folly, even foolishness and madness. It seems kind of like a contradiction in terms there. With wisdom to seek these things out that aren't wise. Kind of bizarre in my mind. But he's leading this to this other thought. And this next thought can probably tend to be somewhat offensive to the ladies. But I think we can explain it. But let's read verse 26 and 28. I think we have to view it in the context of this book and in these passages here. So as Solomon is seeking this for wickedness, folly, foolishness, and madness, in verse 26, I find more bitter than death the woman, whose heart is snares and nets, and her hands as bands. Whoso pleaseth God shall escape from her, but the sinner shall be taken by her. Behold, this have I found, saith the preacher, counting one by one to find out the account, which yet my soul seeketh, but I find not. One man among 1,000 have I found, but a woman among all those have I not found. It sounds like he's being pretty disparaging toward women. But I think we should point out a few things here, and I think that'll kind of bring into the context. So 1 Corinthians 11, let's first get a little background on Solomon. 1 Corinthians 11, verses 1 through 8 reads, "But King Solomon loved many strange women, together with the daughter of Pharaoh, women of the Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Sidonians, and Hittites. Of the nations concerning which the Lord said to the children of Israel, you shall not go into them, neither shall they come into you, for surely they will turn away your heart after their gods. Solomon clave unto these in love. And he had 700 wives, princesses, and 300 concubines, and his wives turned away his heart. For it came to pass, when Solomon was old, that his wives turned away his heart after other gods, and his heart was not perfect with the Lord his God, as was the heart of David his father. For Solomon went after Ashtaroth, the goddess of the Zidonians, and after Milcom, the abomination of the Ammonites. And Solomon did evil in the sight of the Lord, and went not fully after the Lord, as did David his father. Then did Solomon build a high place for Chemosh, the abomination of Moab, in the hill that is before Jerusalem, and for Molech, the abomination of the children of Ammon. And likewise did he for all his strange wives, which burnt incense and sacrifices unto their gods." I'm not going to get too much into these other gods, in fact, really not much at all, but Molech is the one that they would sacrifice children to, put them through that fire, pass their children through the fire. These are terrible things. And so if we come back here now to these passages where Solomon seems to really be disparaging women in general, let's keep in mind previously, did that just get louder? I was up there. Let's keep in mind that previously through this book, Solomon has also been talking about other things like work, achievement, building things. And he's like, man, ultimately these are bad too. These are just falling apart. It's all worthless and pointless. And so I think what he is doing here is painting a perspective for us. Solomon was chasing after strange women, not of God's people, not of people of high moral standing. And he was in pursuit of what? In the previous passages, like wickedness of foolishness, folly, madness, and things like that. And I think as we look at the perspective Solomon is kind of trying to contrast for us throughout this whole book is a life of, the pursuit of immediate physical pleasure in this temporal physical life, as opposed to a pursuit of the spiritual, godly things with an eternal kind of reward or consequence later on. And I think that's where Solomon is talking about women in this instance. That the women you find, or if you're a young woman, the men you find with that type of mindset isn't going to be good generally. If you're looking for just physical gratification, that kind of thing, that's probably what you're going to get. If you're looking for spiritually minded, wise people, and you go to those places to find them, that's probably what you'll find too. You go where the good things are. If you're staying in the sewer, you're going to get dirty. And I think that's kind of it. And of course, I also have up here Proverbs 31, 15 through 31, which I think, Solomon writes that too, paints the portrait of the righteous woman. Speaks very high of women in that case. So I don't think he's like, women are all bad. Even though when you read this, that might be the first thing that comes to your mind when you just pick out these verses and read it. Does that make sense? I feel like I'm rambling here. I just want to defend women if I can. All right. Yes, ma'am.
The sewer and finding dirtiness there, I think the more subtle thing, though, that we experience is the world.
Yes.
We have people right beside us who profess to be Christians who walk and look like they're living a good life, and doing, serving God, but they're not part of His body. And I think the subtlety there is that we accept them for the face value that they present, but then we find the contrast beneath the surface.
Connie, that's a really good, that's an excellent point. usually it's by the extremes, we begin to understand something. It's just when we move away from the extremes toward the center, it's harder to identify that clear line. But you're exactly right. There are people who profess to be godly, profess to be Christians, who show up and do this stuff, but their heart's not really in it. And then when you get to know them or spend real time with them outside of the congregation, you kind of see a very different sort. That's the very subtle kind of things. In the book of Jeremiah, God had Jeremiah, and it was, I love this story because like nothing really happens, I guess, miraculous, but you almost think it is. So Jeremiah, of course, is this prophet, and God says, Jeremiah, take your girdle, and I want you to walk to the Euphrates River, which, that was a long hike. That wasn't like next door. It wasn't the Jordan River or anything. Dude's walking quite a ways through wilderness and stuff like that. And he says, go to the Euphrates, Jeremiah, and bury this girdle there somewhere near the river, around the river, or whatever, and then go home. And then after so much time, go back and dig it up. It's like, oh man, I almost wonder, was Jeremiah like, what miraculous wonder am I going to see when I dig this up? And then when he dug it up, what did he find? It was a dirty girdle. And in some ways it's kind of hilarious, but also an obvious point he's making. Like, you put something in dirty stuff, it's going to get dirty. But again, that's an extreme case. When we walk that back, like, how much hair do you want in your food before you're not going to eat it? How much poo in your water are you going to tolerate? Or I'll still take a sip of that. I'm pretty thirsty. It's only, little bit of bird doo-doo is all right. You're gonna toss that out, right? And I think that's same with people too. If you let a little bit of sin in, you kind of ruin the whole thing. And that's the point. It's been made too. A little leaven ruins the whole lump, kind of thing. That's a great point, Connie. Sorry, I probably spent more time on that than I needed to, but it was an excellent point. And it's a free science lesson. I wouldn't drink anything with poop in it. That's all. Take that that one's for free. All right, verse 29. Lo, this have only I found, that God hath made man upright, but they have sought out many inventions. We won't spend too much time on this, but James 1:13 through 15 is an important passage. God does not tempt man. And man is tempted when he's drawn away from his own lust, and then when lust conceives, it brings forth sin. But God has made man upright. God created us good. We have the ability to either obey God or to disobey God. And we are drawn, we are tempted, and things like that. But God has not made us that way. All right, so let's get here into chapter 8. Verses 1 through 5, I'll just read these. So, who is as the wise man, and who knoweth the interpretation of a thing? A man's wisdom makes his face to shine, and the boldness of his face shall be changed. I counsel thee to keep the king's commandment, and that in regard of the oath of God. Be not hasty to go out of his sight. Stand not in an evil thing, for he doeth whatsoever pleaseth him. Wherefore the word of a king where the word of a king is, there is power. And who may say unto him, what doest thou? Whoso keepeth the commandment shall feel no evil thing. A wise man's heart discerns both time and judgment. Good bit of stuff there. I feel like it's pretty obvious. The first few questions there, who is a wise man, is more of a rhetorical kind of question. Like, if you're a wise man, you're going to listen to what I have to say next. He makes a point here how it kind of changes, the boldness of his face, makes his face to shine. Clearly, it's just talking about how, wisdom is evident upon those who use it. I will take a little tangent here, try to do it very briefly. You can not say a word and be mistaken for wise most of the time. So you don't even have to be wise. You can just be smart enough to not say anything usually, and people will mistake you for being wise. And that's a fun little trick. It's very neat. I'll give you an anecdote. A long time ago, I was in the Army, and I had some issue. I can't remember what the problem was, but I went to talk to my squad leader about it. And he was kind of generally a quiet guy anyways. I was like, well, Sergeant Cash, I need to talk to you. I kind of have this issue. And he just didn't say a word. He just kind of like nodded and listened. He sat there, looked at me very intently, and I explained the issue and kind of waited for a response, but he just kind of sat there. And I think I felt the uncomfortable silence, so I just started talking some more. I'm like, well, maybe this is a possible solution. Maybe I could do this or that, or trying to explain the issue. And he still didn't say a word, just sat there. And I was like, well, I guess maybe I should do this. And he just like, and I was like, well, but then this or that might be the consequence. And so if I did this or that might work out. And he kind of just never said a word, just still looked at me. It was very awkward and uncomfortable. But I had this conversation with myself for longer than it should have happened. But by the end of it, I left thanking Sergeant Cash. I'd figured out the issue. I'd figured out what I was going to do next. I said, thank you, Sergeant Cash. I really appreciate your time. And I walked away. And as I was walking away, I realized, man, that man didn't say a word. Did not say a word at all. And I figured everything out. And I thanked him for it. So that's a lesson too. A lot of times being wise, man, is just faking it, Just if you stay quiet, nobody can say anything against you half the time. All right, so there's that. About wisdom. And Solomon here goes on in verse 2, I counsel thee to keep the king's commandment, and that in regard of the oath of God. So Solomon's saying, I as the king charged you, Israel, to honor God. To honor God, respect God, and listen to him. And so that's what I've told you to do. And in verses 3 and 4, be not hasty to go out of his sight. Stand not in an evil thing, for he doeth whatsoever pleases him. Where the word of a king is, there is power. And who may say unto him, what doest thou? And then, whoso keepeth the commandment shall feel no evil thing. If you just read this straight through, it seems like he's talking about the king. I, as the king, this is what you ought to do. But I think because he reminded them to keep that oath I commanded you to do, I think we can take this double meaning. It's not just the king, it's also God, who is much more powerful than the king. If you should stay in the presence of this good king, how much more should we stay in the presence of God? If we should do the commandment of the king, how much more should we do the commandment of God? And then who keeps the commandment shall feel no evil thing. Again, ultimately, it's God. Even Paul said, basically, act like me as act like Christ, so to speak. These commandments of God and of a good king are intended to help mankind, not be a detriment. But let's look here as the thought continues, verses 8 through 10. And I know I'm kind of rushing through this. If anyone has any thoughts, feel free to interject. I'm hoping that once we finish chapter 8, we have time to maybe turn back around and hit a few other points. But so please, if anybody has anything, just chime in. All right, verses 8 through 10. There is no man that hath power over the Spirit to retain the Spirit. Neither hath he power in the day of death, and there is no discharge in that war. Neither shall wickedness deliver those that are given to it. All this have I seen, and applied my heart unto every work that is done under the sun. There is a time wherein one man ruleth over another to his own hurt. And so I saw the wicked buried, who had come and gone from the place of the holy, where they were forgotten in the city wherein they had so done. This also is vanity. We're all going to die, and there's nothing we can do about it. And once we get to that point, we are not judging ourselves. God's judging. Christ is judging. They'll determine what happens to our soul when we die, not us. And if we choose to do wickedness in this life, you're not going to be able to choose whether you live or die. And you're not going to be able to choose what happens with your soul. The way we live is basically the only thing we can do to steer the trajectory of our souls. And again, Solomon is in this book appears to be almost consumed with this idea of death. It's a real buzzkill, right? Like it's just things are just going to end. But as I say, as we get through this book, it's leading us somewhere, and I think this is another hint of it too. We don't choose, but someone will. And as far as this ruling, to one man's hurt, here in this example, I think he's given basically you have someone who's maybe a unrighteous kind of like ruler, maybe in a religious setting, who, when he dies, it doesn't help him when he's forgotten and so forth. But again, a lot of this, and we'll get to more of this too here as we move along, but there's just a lot of sometimes things are unfair either. Even if you're a righteous ruler and things go bad for you, man, sometimes that just happens. It's unfortunate. Verse 11, because the sentence against an evil deed is not executed speedily, the heart of the children of man is fully set to do evil. And I do like constantly looking ahead, verses 13 and 14 of chapter 12. But God's going to bring every work into judgment, whether it's secret, whether it's good, whether it's evil. There will be an account of everything that we do. But this is true because we feel like something isn't immediate. We tend to forget. Man, if you ever remember being a kid or something, or I guess it works for adults too. Like, this is something you really need to do. It's probably going to take discipline and work. You really need to do it, whatever it is. You want an allowance. You want, save up money to go on a trip. You want to, cut 10 pounds or something like that. You're like, yeah, I'm gonna work hard. I've got a plan. I'm gonna do this and that. It takes a lot of discipline, but I can do it. I made my plan and I stick it out. And then you find you stick it out for a week or two, maybe a couple of days, and it just goes on too long. The payoff is far too down the road. It's just easier to do this, easier to give into this. I think it's a similar kind of idea here with this. I shouldn't do evil, but I kind of want to. And again, you're talking about degrees. Sometimes we're not talking like murdering somebody or robbing a bank, but even like the small little kind of subtle things. Well, it's not that big of a deal. I can do it right now, and move on with it, and don't. There will be a reckoning. There will be a judgment. But because it often seems so far down the road, we think there's, maybe there's not any real harm. This verse does remind me of the Republic, Plato's Republic. So in Book 10 of Plato's Republic, and he writes a lot of dialogue. So Socrates is having these discussions with people. Plato writes a lot of dialogues and a lot about Socrates. But in Book 10 of Plato's Republic, Socrates is having a discussion. They're trying to find out, what the just man is and so forth. And somehow something about the soul comes up. Let me see if I can paraphrase this good enough. And let's put this in a little bit of time context. So Solomon lived in around like the 900s BC. Socrates lived 400s, maybe 300s BC. Aristotle, of course, came after, and Alexander the Great about 330 or so BC. Anyways, Socrates is talking about the soul, and he's like, I've noticed that some things are good and bad. So like rust is bad, right? It's almost like an evil. It destroys steel. And like poison, disease is kind of like an evil. It destroys the body. There's some things that are good for body, some things that are bad for it. And things that are bad tend to destroy whatever thing they affect. And he's like, so I think, and I'm really paraphrasing, he's like, so I think from that we can kind of deduce the soul is eternal, because we know there are some things that are good, moral, just, and there are things that are immoral, unjust, which those would be bad. But if they're bad, why don't they kill the soul? And it's like when someone does something unjust or immoral, they don't just die, right? They have to be executed. They have to be put to death. And it's like, so the soul doesn't die, I'm afraid. I think the soul is eternal. And I think one that's interesting, because you have this pagan man who had no real knowledge of God, who's already just by reason alone thinking about these things and understanding that there must be a soul and it must be eternal. And that there must be some consequence for evil also. But it is the same kind of thought too. It is so far, whatever that is going to be, is so far removed. And because our any immoral act or unjust act doesn't drop us dead or destroy our soul right there. We kind of, sometimes tend to forget, like, man, I'm just enjoying it and whatever. I'll worry about that later. And that's really not how it works, not the right mindset. All right, let's look here, verses 12 through 14. Though a sinner do evil 100 times, and his days are prolonged, yet surely I know that it shall be well with them that fear God, which fear before him. But it shall not be well with the wicked, neither shall he prolong his days, which are as a shadow, because he feareth not before God. There is a vanity which is done upon the earth, that there is a just man unto whom it happens according to the work of the wicked. Again, there is a wicked man to whom it happens according to the work of the righteous. I said that this also is vanity. I mean, life is just unfair sometimes. But if a sinner happens to do well in this life, they're not going to do well after this life. And if a righteous man doesn't do well in this life, well, he will do well in the next life, the eternal life, the one that counts and matters. But this life is often unfair. Things don't always seem to make sense or work out the way you want. All right, here. Yeah, let's wrap up chapter 8. In verse 15, then I commended mirth. Anyone with the ESV probably says joy. So then I commended mirth or joy, because a man hath no better thing under the sun than to eat and to drink and to be merry. For that shall abide with him of his labor, the days of his life, which God gives him under the sun. When I applied my heart to know wisdom, and to see the business that is done upon the earth, for also there is neither day nor night seeth sleep with his eyes. Then I beheld all the work of God, that a man cannot find out the work that is done under the sun, because though a man labor to seek it out, yet he shall not find it. Yea, further, though a wise man know to do it, yet shall he not be able to find it. I did want to bring up this difference here. So there is a distinction between mirth and joy, generally as we use it. So I looked up the word here. I didn't look it up other places, but it's the Hebrew word simcha, which can actually mean either joy, gladness, or mirth. And so either translation appears to be accurate enough. I think the point of this passage here, again, like we've looked at before, this isn't the first time we've seen this, I think it is okay to enjoy blessings God has given you. If you've gotten a reward for your labor, it's okay to enjoy that. If you had a hard day's work, you have a chance for a little bit of repose and relaxation, it's good to enjoy that, and it's good to thank God for that. That's okay. We have to put things in their context, of course. You can't just chill out all the time. You can't laugh and be a dummy all the time. You got to put things in their place, a time and place for everything. And the Solomon here, he'll constantly talk about wisdom as a sore travail, or how it's just sorrow. But if you strive for this wisdom and this understanding of things, if you keep trying to figure things out, it can really trouble you enough to where you can rob you of sleep. He's just saying it can be stressful. And then he goes on to say it can be stressful, but you're also not ever going to get to a point where you know everything anyways. There's always going to be some limit to our understanding. There's going to be some gaps in our knowledge, always. And I think that's true. I think that's true. Now, I want to... So that is chapter 8. So now we get to go on a few tangents if we want to, with our time remaining here. I always liked Genesis 11:6. I may have even referenced in here before, but it was at the Tower of Babel. God's watching man build these towers, up to the heavens and so forth. And he makes that phrase, says that phrase, and now nothing will be restrained from them which they have imagined to do. It's a small phrase. I don't think I'm taking too many liberties with it, but I think it's kind of like there'll be a lot of things man is able to achieve. We've sent men to the moons and rockets into space, all sorts of neat stuff, all sorts of terrible stuff. But one thing we have to remember as we do these things, there's still so much we don't know and can't know. We've got the Isaiah 55, 8 and 9. For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, saith the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts. And then Paul in 1 Corinthians 1:25, because the foolishness of God is wiser than man, and the weakness of God is stronger than man. I think humankind will never reach a point where there is like nothing left to learn. There's always going to be some things we don't know and can't know. And I think once we get to a place that we thought might have been a limit, and this has happened, right? The cell's the smallest building block ever. And then you get like a better device. Okay, well actually there's smaller stuff inside that cell. And then it's like, well, the atom is the smallest thing ever. And then you break that apart and you see, it's made up of tiny stuff in there. And as we look deeper too, those are made up of smaller things too. I think there's never going to be an end, and we can go the opposite direction. Joe was pointing this out in a class last week or 2 weeks ago. I can't keep up. But about the universe, it's this far. But when you get there, you look out and like, there's actually more. And you get there and like, there's actually further to go. This is interesting to me, maybe not to anybody else. But I got curious. I saw an article maybe 2 weeks ago. Maybe even just 1 week ago, but it was, so the age of the known universe, anybody know what they say it is, the age of the known universe? And I just mean what generally, I don't mean like per the Bible, I just mean per what they, the infamous they say. It's like 13.7 billion years old. And then a week or two ago, I saw an article, it's like, we actually, based on this like Webb telescope, now know the age of the universe is 26.7 billion years old. Well, that's a 13 billion year leap we made in like a day. Like, that's incredible. But if you go back and look at the history of the knowledge of these timelines, it wasn't that long ago. It was like, it was 6 billion years old. It was 1 billion years old. You go back further than that. And so it's like we make incredible leaps in time in just moments when we look. And so the reality is we don't know. Like, they don't know. And they'll present it as fact, but you don't know. And it illustrates that point too. As you get to a boundary, what you thought was a boundary or limit, you realize it's really limitless. And so you have to readjust what you're thinking if you're trying to figure it out. Also, if you're trying to figure things out and your framework doesn't involve God, I would tell you, you might find different solutions than you would otherwise. But man, I know I have like mangled any type of science topic the few times we've been in here. Does anybody else have any comment on that before we move on? Anybody want to straighten me out on anything? I think a lot about this. I read a lot about this stuff, and trying to summarize it in a few moments, sometimes I feel like I've really just messed things up, made things very confusing. Hopefully not too bad. So maybe I'll ignore the temptation to do it again this morning. But if anyone had a thought, feel free to make it. Well, okay. I'll tell you what. I'm gonna dive in anyways, just a little bit. Because I think it's an important thing to remember, and it's basically like how we use our terms. And what do people mean? What do we mean when we say it? What do other people mean when they say it, and so forth? So, what is the method that humankind, typically uses to discover things about the natural physical world today? You can probably summarize it in one word, I think, but anybody have any? What's the method we use to discover these things today, to understand more about the earth and universe today? Observation, right, which is a part of science. I was going to say science, but you're right. Observation is a key component of science. And I was going to say science because observation yields hard data. Well, observation does yield some data and often irrefutable facts. Sometimes it also leaves question marks. Why is this or how that or other questions. But, science is science, hard data, and irrefutable facts. Well, yeah, that's part of science. Does science also include like interpretation, assumptions, conclusions based on that hard data and facts? Well, yeah, that's actually part of science too. But we can see these two things are not equal in weight, right? These things are not exactly the same. A hard, fast measurement is not the same as my interpretation of that measurement, or an assumption I have to make. I don't quite know how that got here, and then I have this big question mark, so I'll plug it with something and see if that works or where that takes me. And oftentimes that's how things go. So I guess that's all I'll say about that, unless anybody else has anything to plug. All right. Let's come back to Ecclesiastes 21 and 22. 7, 21 and 22. I'm going to read these verses again. Also take no heed unto all the words that are spoken, lest thou hear thy servant curse thee. For oftentimes also thine own heart knows that you yourself likewise hast cursed others. 1 Peter 3. If y'all want to turn there too. Why not? 1 Peter 3, you probably know this passage, 15 through 17. But sanctify the Lord God in your hearts, and be ready always to give an answer to every man that asks you a reason of the hope that is in you with meekness and fear, having a good conscience, that whereas they speak evil of you as evildoers, they may be ashamed that falsely accuse your good conversation in Christ. For it is better, if the will of God be so, that ye suffer for well-doing than for evil-doing. I mainly wanted to look at verse 16 in this passage, because if people are speaking evil of you, hopefully and ideally we're living in such a way to where they would actually be ashamed for doing so, because we're living good, righteous lives according to God's pattern and plan, and there's nothing really bad they can say about us anyways. That's the goal, to live that way, and to say that's probably number one. That should be our primary purpose: to serve God, keep His commandments. And so if someone does speak evil of us, it won't be true, won't hold up. But people will still likely say bad things about you, think ill of you, try to cheat you and abuse you. And man, 1 Corinthians 6, like I say, I think it's huge when we really start looking at it. But the brethren in Corinth there were having several issues as they went along, and Paul spends a lot of his time in this book correcting those issues. And then here in 1 Corinthians 6, he's talking about these brothers who are quarreling against each other. They have issues with each other, and they become like legal matters. They're taking each other to court and stuff like that. And Paul's saying, why are you taking your brethren to court? And what's interesting is he doesn't say, let's say maybe you're taking your brother to court because your brother has defrauded you. He's actually done something wrong against you. Paul doesn't really spend his time saying, don't defraud your brethren. In fact, one of the main points he makes, like in verse 7 of 1 Corinthians 6, is why not be defrauded? If your brother's defrauding you, don't go to court. Don't take this before, some secular, civil kind of matter. You're supposed to be higher than that. It's better to be defrauded than to do that. I mean, why? And how is that? And it's because we're supposed to be living in the world, not of the world. We're supposed to be trying to be spiritual people existing on this earth. And so if we're defrauded, in what way? It's material goods usually, right? It's like, don't make an issue with your brethren, especially in front of the world, over stuff like that. I mean, clearly don't defraud your brethren, But Paul here is telling us to think a little higher. And going back to that Ecclesiastes 7, 21 and 22, don't be upset if someone's talking evil against you. This almost takes it a step further, but it is of that same mind, of that same vein. And then Matthew 5, 38 and 34 too, this is kind of the passage of forgiveness here in Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. If someone takes you to court for your coat, give them your shirt also. Someone wants you to go with them a mile, go with them too. That kind of thing. It's that whole mindset that Christ calls us to have. And I have Romans 14 up here. It's a very interesting chapter in 14, but it's about brethren who disagree on certain things. Ultimately, these are things that are not doctrinal, but I kind of feel like, it usually lumps them into a weaker brother, stronger brother. I feel like oftentimes, the weaker brother probably feels like maybe they are doctrinal. They may not always know, or else I don't think they would be weak. But it's how we deal with our brethren. So if someone, I like eating meat and everything else, but if someone had a problem, like a moral problem, I think it's actually sinful to eat meat, or this type of meat, or meat prepared this way, or meat in general. And I think primarily in Romans 14 probably had more to do with meat that was perceived to be sacrificed to idols. Although I don't know that it says that specifically. But if anyone had such an issue, instead of me well, you shouldn't be telling me how I should live, that's wrong of you to do it. Paul doesn't say that in Romans. He says, don't eat meat in front of them. Don't eat meat in front of them. And that is the mindset we're supposed to have, the heart of love we're supposed to have toward our brethren. All right, that's it. Next week, Scott Shanahan, you get a break from Ecclesiastes and me, and then we'll pick up the week following, hopefully chapters 9 and 10, thereabout. Thank you.